Get started then. So we're here to discuss the paper in
Okay.
defense of merit in science. We have Anna Krylov, who's one of the co-authors of the paper. She is USC Associate Professor of Natural Sciences and Professor of
In an academic
History.
thing talk.
Could you silence your mics, please? Her work is on excited states processes initiated by light. She's won many awards, including an NSF Career Award and the Direct Medal. She's also well known for her work on academic freedom. She's a member of the leadership team of the Academic Freedom Alliance and corresponding author of the article we'll be discussing today. Michael Strevens, who's with us online, is professor of philosophy at New York University. He works on the philosophy of science. His interests include explanation, complex systems, probability, confirmation, and the social structure of science and its role in science's success. I've asked Professor Krylov to begin by discussing why the co-authors decided to write the paper, the group's experience trying to publish it, feedback since publication, and any new thoughts about themes in the paper. And she may want to cover some of the major themes as well. Professor Strevens will then comment for 10 to 15 minutes. And at that point, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. We're very happy that you're with us today, Anna and Michael. And so let's get started with Anna's presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I've spoken at UCR many times, but only about chemistry and only to chemists and chemical engineers. So I'm very pleased to give this talk at the CIVIC series. So this is a story about our paper titled In Defense of Merit in Science. The paper is long, but the thesis presented in it is very simple. It is merit-based science is effective and fair, and abandoning merit-based policies doesn't bode well for science and society. So why such an obvious, even banal idea needs to be defended? In the paper, we document current attacks on merit that we witness in all STEM disciplines and show the alarming trends of how the universalists' merit-based practices are replaced by ideology. The paper was written by an international and interdisciplinary group of 29 authors. The reason we all came together is that we are alarmed by what we see happening in our institutions, at universities, funding agencies, and publishing houses. Given the broad significance of the topic, we submitted the paper to the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was rejected by them, and then it was rejected by a few other outlets. Eventually, it was published in a new journal called the Journal of Controversial Ideas. Despite this unusual outlet, the paper has generated some interest. According to the editor, Peter Singer, it was read more than 100,000 times in the first 3 weeks after publication. So say what you want about its content, but you cannot deny that the topic is of broad interest. Merit-based science is effective. It gives us vaccines, antibiotics, fertilizers, computers, and iPhones. Science transformed lives of humankind worldwide. This plot shows life expectancy broken by different parts of the world. Before Industrial Revolution, human life was short, very short. The steady increase came on the heels of Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. It is a result of new technologies, such as production of fertilizers and modern science-based medicine. I can relate to this plot personally. I grew up in Ukraine hearing family stories from my grandmother. The recurring theme was death of women at childbirth, death of breadwinners from tuberculosis and other maladies, death of many children in every family. And of course, famine and hunger. It is because of merit-based science that these stories of suffering are a thing of the past in most parts of the world. Merit-based science is fair. It allows people like myself, who came to the US with nothing but clothes on my back, to build successful careers. There are more impressive examples than me. So many Nobel laureates who work in the USA or in Europe came from abroad. Here is Ugur Sahin, the man who gave us COVID vaccine and is now super rich. He came to Germany from Turkey and built successful careers there. Here is an American example, Steve Jobs, the man who gave us Apple computers and iPhone. He was raised in a poor adoptive family and had no access to regular education. Yes, playing field is unequal, but meritocracy is the best way we have to ensure equal opportunity. So why this idea needs to be defended, and how the paper with such a mundane title has ended in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. If you cannot wrap your head around it, you are not alone. Here are some expressions of incredulity on social media. Ben Gibrad writes, "It's crazy enough that an article titled "In Defense of Merit in Science" needs publishing. It's mind-blowing that it's published in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. What's next? In defense of not drinking battery fluid?" But PNAS editors had different opinion. Here is the feedback we received following our initial inquiry. The board was concerned with the word merit in the title of the paper. They wrote, quote, "The problem is that the concept of merit, as the authors surely know, has been widely and legitimately attacked as implemented." They finish with an advice. If the authors could use a different term, I would encourage that. We considered changing this, but ultimately we're not able to address all editorial concerns. Here is final editorial response to our appeal, which clearly reveals ideological grounds for rejection. Our paper challenged the prevailing orthodoxy about systemic isms, and therefore, as editor wrote, quote, "It is downright hurtful to the legions of minority scientists who are or are not but wanted to be in STEM. Many such individuals were kept out precisely because of those exclusionary institutional features that are claimed to be absent from the Western scientific enterprise." End of quote. No references were provided to support this statement. So this is how we ended up in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. So let me tell you why we decided to write this paper. To set things in context, I will start with a brief personal introduction and then show some exhibits illustrating the current attacks on merit and offer my view of why undermining merit in science is perilous. I was born in a country that is no longer on the map, USSR. I grew up in Ukraine and studied at Moscow State University. The life of people under socialism was different. This is my picture from the school album after the first grade. This is me and my friends from Moscow State University. It's not a gulag. We are doing the mandatory potato duty, digging potatoes from mud, to help the collective farm workers to save the harvest. We didn't smile often. In 1991, the wall came down and we fled to Israel. I received my PhD at the Hebrew University in 1996 and then went to do my postdoctoral training in Berkeley. In 1998, I took my job at USC. In 1996, I was blown away by the American culture. By culture, I do not mean McDonald's, Disneyland, drive-through movies, and Hollywood. By culture, I mean how people interacted with each other, how organizations were run merit-based, open to different ideas and people from different backgrounds, tolerant, pluralistic. It was quite a contrast to what I experienced in the USSR. So things were good for a chemistry postdoc back then. Until 2020, I was living a typical life of a chemistry professor, teaching, writing grants and chemistry papers. But then things changed. For me and many other STEM faculty, the change appeared sudden, but now I understand that the poison was brewing since the 80s. So in 2020, I felt deja vu, like being thrown back to the USSR. The old books that I thought lost their relevance to contemporary affairs all of a sudden became relevant again. That is what prompted me to start writing non-chemistry papers. I wrote this essay, The Peril of Politicizing Science, where I highlighted these parallels. The invasion and omnipresence of ideology. A very peculiar ideology. This is what its tenets are. Everything, including science, is racist, sexist, colonial. The existing social inequalities and unequal representations are due to systemic racism and sexism in the present. Everything, including academia, is about power struggle between the oppressors and oppressed. Everything, including science and education, needs to be dismantled and rebuilt to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those who are not with us are against us and must be punished. Here is graphics communicating these ideas, a cover from Science magazine and a picture from Nature Geoscience. The name of this ideology is critical social justice, colloquially called wokeism. Subject to small adjustments, this sounds remarkably similar to what I was taught back in the USSR. The philosophical origins of critical social justice are postmodernism, critical theories, and ultimately Marxism. I feel almost nostalgic because I heard these things before. I was schooled in them. We were told that the world is a struggle between oppressors and oppressed, and that everything should be viewed through this lens. We were told that there is bourgeois science and proletariat science. The proletariat science is good because it serves the cause of the world revolution. And bourgeois science is bad because it's a servant or a whore of the capitalism. Here is a cartoon from the Soviet satirical magazine. It shows bourgeois science and a boat full of revisionists, those philosophers who dared to upgrade Marxist doctrine to fix its most obvious failures. On the far right is a poster from the Soviet times. It says, Lenin is dead, but his cause is alive. Unlike many other Soviet slogans, this one turned out to be true. This ideology is literally everywhere. The disdain to meritocracy is in its core. DII is a name under which it operates. Most concerning to me and my co-authors is the intrusion of DEI into science and science education. STEM education literature is now full of articles dedicated to DEI. Here are a couple of examples. A special topic class on, quote, feminism and science as a tool to disrupt the disconscious racism in STEM, end of quote. One module of this class explores, quote, the development and interrelationship between quantum mechanics, Marxist materialism, Afrofuturism, pessimism, and post-colonial nationalism. To problematize time as a linear social construct, the Copenhagen interpretation of the collapse of wave-particle duality was utilized. End of quote. So it sounds like an article from The Onion or an AI-generated gibberish, but it is for real. This is a real class taught in an American university at East Carolina University. Some students took it for credit towards their degree. Some parents paid tuition for their children to be educated in this. This is concerning. Another example from biology, how students should be taught biology of sex using fungus that doesn't have gametic sexes instead of mammals, in the name of inclusivity. And from physics, the authors analyze the lessons in physics class. Whiteboard is mentioned as one of the exhibits of whiteness. I'm not making it up. You can read these papers by yourself. If you think that these examples are outliers and are limited to some backwater schools or some loony proposals from education literature, you are wrong. Here is a recent example from the Rice University. A course in Afrochemistry is offered under chemistry listing. In this course, students will explore the intersection of racial justice and chemistry. So, where does our intellectual leadership stand on this? Learned societies such as National Academy of Sciences have adopted the critical social justice narrative and changed the way they operate. For example, NAS now penalizes the nominating committee if their nominations are not sufficiently diverse. Here is what the president of NAS, Marcia McNutt, says in her own words, quote, "Not so long ago, the NAS might have naively argued that its membership could not reflect the diversity of the American public until universities fit the leaky pipeline, or until schools started motivating more students of color to study STEM and prepared them for success. But in 2021, it's simply not acceptable to wait for bottom-up solution. That is, the idea of solving the problems at the bottom where they exist is passé. One can argue that the membership in NAS is not something to be concerned about, that it's irrelevant to practice of science. But NAS is an influential organization. It provides recommendations to the government, universities, and funding agencies. In 2023, NAS released a report, 360 pages long, titled Advancing Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in STEM Organizations, Beyond Broadening Participation. Here is a quote for your enjoyment. The report describes merit as non-objective, culturally construed concept used to hide biases and perpetuate privilege. It refers to objectivity and meritocracy in STEM as myth and calls for merit-based metrics of evaluation be dismantled. Funding agencies are also taken by this ideology. Now, if you wish to apply for Department of Energy funding, in addition to the technical proposal, you must include a plan how to incorporate and advance diversity, equity, and inclusion through your research. You have a brilliant idea how to solve energy problem? Don't get too excited. DOE wants to know what your plan for advancing DEI. In a truly Orwellian manner, DOE promised to update the DOE merit review program to improve equitable outcomes for DOE awards. Now, equitable doesn't mean fair. Equitable means equal outcomes for each identity group. Here is NASA, how it describes its goals. They are committed to building workforce that reflects the diversity of the American people. Not building workforce that will excel in space exploration, but workforce that reflects American demographics. Scientists seeking NASA funding should now include inclusion plan in addition to the technical proposal. Here is what NASA wants to see in these plans. The PIs must devote time, effort, and money to DEI activities, and also hire DEI experts as consultants to advise the team on the proposed DEI activities. Consider paying them well too, says the document. The assessment of the inclusion plan will be based, quote, the extent to which the inclusion plan demonstrated awareness of systemic barriers to creating inclusive working environments that are specific to the proposal team, end of quote. That means that applicants must confess that there are systemic barriers in their teams, regardless whether this is true or not. The plans will be evaluated by panels made of 50% scientists and 50% DEI professionals. Perhaps the most striking example of the ideological subversion of science is scientific publishing. The telos or purpose of scientific publisher is to facilitate the communication of valid scientific research. This is accomplished through rigorous peer review and by editorial work aiming to identify and rectify possible flaws in submitted manuscripts. This process serves as an epistemic funnel It accepts numerous ideas and propositions, but only those that withstand the scrutiny of the reality-based community of experts emerge out the other end. Now publishers augment or even replace their core mission by critical social justice. It manifests itself by the Orwellian language games, by suppression of ideas and research findings, and by infusing DI criteria in the editorial process. Publishers are quite upfront about it. We have written a paper documenting these issues, but in the interest of time, I will only share these two examples. This is a screenshot from PNAS website. Instructions to authors on what they should consider when suggesting potential reviewers of the submitted manuscript. Here is what they say. PNAS believes diversity is an important factor in ensuring a balanced manuscript review. What kind of diversity? Intellectual diversity? Diversity of technical expertise? They clarify. Please consider gender, race, ethnicity, and the country of origin when suggesting potential reviewers. One may say that perhaps this type of social engineering is not damaging to the actual science. Perhaps editors and reviewers chosen by DI criteria can still do their job with some competence. Perhaps. But DI doesn't stop at social engineering. Have you heard of citation justice? So this is a hot topic in certain cycles. The idea is that your citations should be chosen to be racially and gender balanced. If adopted, this will directly affect the content of the published papers. Rather than providing a background to your findings and supporting your arguments, the citations will be advancing critical social justice. There are already software tools to evaluate gender balance in your citations, and some journals encourage authors to use them. Our paper showed many more exhibits of these ideological attacks on merit. I want to emphasize that this struggle between enlightenment and critical social justice is not about philosophy or academia. It's not a cultural war. The outcome of this struggle will determine where we will be. It would serve us well to learn from history. Merit-based science leads to progress and wealth. Ideology-based science leads to decline. To conclude, I find the current situation precarious. The critical social justice ideology is pernicious and it must be stopped. But to stop it, people must act. Currently, the majority is against DI, but most keep silent. Some say it's not important. It's just a pillow fight among academics. To this I say it's not. The ideology is already undermining our research, education, and funding in a major way. Some say it's a pendulum, it will swing back. To that I want to remind about the USSR. The pendulum that was set in motion in 1917 never came back. Some say they want to stay out of trouble. To them, I want to remind that trouble will find them if the ideological takeover will continue. The only way to stay safe is to stop spread of this ideology. I hope that by highlighting the perils of abandoning meritocracy, our paper will incite the resistance among academics. I conclude with the words of Glenn Lowry. The stakes are high and the hour is late. Thank you.
Michael, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Do you want to get started now?
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to be there. I guess here I am broadcasting from New York City, but hello to everyone on the West Coast. I'm, as Steven said, a philosopher of science. My research is, or part of my research is into the question of how science works. And I don't think I was invited to to defend replacing merit with ideology or anything like that, but rather to take a closer look at what's involved in the merit-based conception of science and comment a little bit on that. And I do, in fact, have, although I'm certainly not an enemy of science or of merit, have a certain criticism of the merit-based picture that's actually offered in the paper that Professor Krylov and her co-authors have published. I think it provides a somewhat misleading picture of the way that science works, which is, well, for someone like me who wants to understand why science is such a powerful technology for discovering how the world works, first of all, of course, is a problem. But also, I think the kind of picture there, in some ways, can create some difficulties with public trust for science. I'll say, hopefully, I'll have time to just say a couple of things about that at the end of my comments. So let me just jump right in and tell you what I'm thinking here. The idea of merit and merit-based science does have a specific meaning in the paper. Science is meritorious if it is well supported by the evidence, or at least the evidence suggests that it's going to be promising and it addresses important questions. Certainly nothing wrong with merit in those senses, but the idea that science should be merit-based, I think, has bound up in it the idea that science should be guided by the evidence. Okay, what's wrong with that? You might think that indeed to come out against the idea that science should be guided by the evidence is tantamount to drinking battery fluid. But I do think there's something about it which is not entirely wrong, but also not entirely right. So let me continue. And probably since I just have a few minutes, maybe the best thing for me to do would be to use an example. This is an example I use in my recent book, The Knowledge Machine, which is supposed to be a story about how science really works. It's an example that's actually been much discussed by philosophers of science, by sociologists of science. And I think there's a lot to learn from this example, precisely because in some ways it gives us a pretty accurate picture of the way science often works, and works well, I should say. So the story is the story of the way that Arthur Eddington, the English physicist, tested Einstein's new general theory of relativity right after Einstein had presented the theory, right after the end of the First World War, by sailing off to observe a total eclipse of the sun and to make measurements that would test whether Einstein's new theory made better predictions about the degree to which light is bent by gravity than the prevailing classical physics did. So the idea was simply to make measurements of that bending angle and to see whether they were closer to the predictions of Einstein's theory, or let's just call it Newton's theory. So the expedition was in some ways successful. It brought back a lot of data. Some of that data was very clear, but it had mixed implications. But there were several telescopes. There were a couple of different locations. And some of the evidence very clearly supported Einstein's predictions, but some of the evidence actually was more in conformance with Newton's predictions. Now, that same evidence was taken by a telescope that seemed to have something going wrong with it at the time of the eclipse. Unfortunately, of course, that sort of thing happens all the time in science. So the photographs were slightly blurry, but it wasn't clear, as Eddington and his co-authors themselves say when they published their research. It wasn't clear whether there was just a lack of focus in the pictures, in which case some usable data could certainly be retrieved from the photos. And in fact, as Eddington and his co-authors said, this data actually was much more in line with Newton's predictions than Einstein's predictions. But it was also possible that something had gone wrong, that had actually systematically distorted the data, in which case it would have been pretty much worthless. The question is, which of those two was it? And it wasn't clear. I mean, the meta question was no clearer than the photographs themselves, what to do. Eddington and co. kind of charged ahead and said, we're just going to ignore that. What we have is this really nice data in favor of Einstein, and succeeded in convincing many scientists at the time that this data was really strong evidence that Einstein was right. But some other scientists who did very much the same thing, including American astronomer W.W. Campbell, who himself had led actually an expedition just a year or so before to make exactly the same measurements, which had gone disastrously wrong and which had returned some data that Eddington and co. themselves said was not much use. Campbell was more worried about the way that the results of that telescope had just been ignored. In fact, it was Campbell who then led an expedition a couple of years later to Australia during another eclipse that really nailed down the case in favor of Einstein. So what we have here, first of all, is a good example of science at work, and what's more, science at work in a certain sense following the evidence. Now, when we look back, we would say there's really no question that Einstein's theory makes the correct prediction about the bending angle of light. That doesn't mean we know that Einstein's theory is correct. There are some reasons to think it's not, because it doesn't fit well with quantum mechanics, but still, at least it makes the right predictions about the bending angle. But at the time, things were much less clear. Now, this case got picked up. I mean, there's so many cases like it in science, I think, but this case got picked up and examined by many historians, sociologists, philosophers, so we know a lot about it. But what I want to talk about is not really whether Eddington was right to dismiss the results, those Newtonian results, or whether Campbell was right to kind of slam on the brakes and say not so fast. What I want to emphasize is there was a serious debate between the two of them about the significance of the evidence. If somebody had just bust into the room and said, look, what we should do here is just follow the science, we should do what the evidence tells us to do, that would not have been very useful advice. Now, here's the interesting thing. People today, although we're all pretty much certain that Einstein's theory makes the better predictions, are still arguing about the reasonableness of the Eddington team's decision to throw away those results. So in some sense, the debate, there was just a book published on this in 2019, actually, by Daniel Kennefick, a physicist who's a kind of a defender of Eddington against his critics. So this is Eddington's experiment, 1919, Kennefick's book, 2019, 100 years later, and people are still arguing about the significance of those results. So how is it exactly that progress was made? Well, it was made by simply going out and doing more experiments. So Campbell had his criticisms of Eddington. Did people listen to those criticisms? Well, some people didn't. Maybe some people did. But in some sense, it didn't really matter. And it certainly doesn't matter for physics how that dispute is resolved even today. What happened is Campbell just sailed off on his own expedition and brought in more data. And I think so often in science, the way that arguments about well, let me back up a little bit. First of all, there are many disputes between scientists who are perfectly sincere and intent on finding the truth, disputes that follow from different experiences of operating different pieces of machinery. Sometimes they're political disputes. This particular dispute probably was not especially ideological, although it probably did have a lot to do with the personal investment that Campbell and Eddington had respectively put into their different missions to perform a similar experiment. There are many disputes. Typically in science, I think these disputes about the significance of the evidence are not resolved. They're not resolved anyway at a time where they would be, where a resolution would be useful. Now we can look back and say, yeah, something must have been wrong with that telescope that made it look like Newton was right, but it's pretty much of no use now to say that. So the way that science progresses, I think, is not in the short term, is not, as it were, by swimming up the merit gradient, by reaching an agreement on what the evidence is saying and proceeding one step at a time on the basis of that agreement. I mean, sometimes that happens often enough, but much of the time, the significance of the evidence, right when it would need to be resolved in order to guide science in the right direction, the significance of the evidence is controversial and it's left unresolved. Science doesn't so much correct itself. It doesn't so much go back and sort of debate the issue of the merit of the evidence until finally a resolution is reached, as just generate more evidence. The Campbells of the world go sailing off and they bring back more data in time over years, tens of years, sometimes even a longer time scale. Yes, the evidence does decide the issue. In that sense, we can look back and say, oh yeah, we can now see that there's no really reasonable way to resist the evidence in favor of Einstein. But I don't think we can see this process as a process of following the meritorious evidence step by step. So why is that important? I think it's important in a couple of ways. But maybe I should go straight to the issue of public trust in science and finish there. So the general public, agreeing with perhaps with Professor Krylov's picture of science as an institution that makes progress precisely because it's able to look at the evidence in a clear-eyed way and see exactly where it's leading, sees science for what it really is. Maybe they read in my book or somebody else's book about the Eddington case and see that there's the disagreements about the evidence. Maybe it's in real time they're seeing debates about say the anti-COVID measures or about climate change unroll in a way that shows that scientists don't have any clear agreement on the evidence when it really matters, and they think that science is not living up to the merit-based ideal that it is supposed to be the secret to successful science, and so they start to think that science is just another online argument with people shouting at one another and nobody really knowing how to be right or wrong. If only they knew, I think, if only the general public knew that science has always been a matter of disagreement about the evidence in the short term, that this is the way it's supposed to be, that you shouldn't look for a clear-eyed, objective evaluation of the evidence at every step for a consensus-based process that takes one step at a time based on what everyone agrees is merit or not merit. That's just not what science looks like. Yes, ultimately it is the evidence that decides the day, and we can look back and say that we can all agree that that is very good, very strong, very clear, very objective evidence. But by then, in some sense, it's too late for the evidence to act as a guide in this way. So just to be clear, I am very much endorsing the idea that science succeeds because it is because of its exclusive concern with empirical evidence and with empirical testing. That is paramount. But the empirical tests do not lead science step by step. There's a lot of disagreement. Some of that disagreement is politically motivated. A lot of it is just a matter of individual differences, differences in background and education, what lab you did your postdoc in. It doesn't matter, because the secret to science is not having short-term consensus on the significance of the evidence. It's the power to create so much evidence that in the end, at the end of the process, consensus is reached. And I believe that if the general public understood that better, then science as it really is, they would see that science as it really is functioning really rather well. There's not a whole lot to worry about. Well, we can always worry about various aspects of science, but that science is even the politicization of science is not necessarily a destructive force. It can be a problem, but it's something that science as a whole can ultimately survive. Okay, I will stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to give Anna a chance to respond at least briefly, and then we'll get to questions and discussion.
I think Eddington lacked in his expedition sufficient racial and gender diversity. Had he had properly gender and racial balanced tip, I think telescope would have delivered precisely accurate data. So I agree. I actually wanted to compliment you on your book, which I am reading now. I haven't finished it yet, but I am enjoying reading it, especially analysis of historical examples of big controversies and how people work on them. So that's delightful. I disagree that somehow the ideas that scientists debate between each other and that evidence that is originally available for some new concept is not sufficient to rule out, to come to the consensus that somehow it undermines the idea of the merit. Merit is still there, and merit is used to decide how good is the evidence, what additional evidence need be done, and we actually have now good, outstanding mathematical tools to quantify it, to put numbers on it. And some people think that that's what made science so successful, the mathematization of the tools that can be used to assess validity of the claim and how robust the conclusions are. So we have statistician here in the audience. You want to say something? Okay. So, all right. Jay is a statistician, so he knows how scientists are doing this.
Yes. So just very briefly, as far as the Eddington case goes and merit, I think it's clear that a clear picture from a telescope is more meritorious than a blurry one. And so the correct way to handle that is to give the more meritorious, clearer pictures more weight than the blurry one in deciding on how that evidence favors one hypothesis or the other. That's just my own comment there.
Can I ask a question? Okay, let me just, yeah, actually.
So we are going to now to questions and discussion. And I'll look at people online. Please raise your yellow hand if you have a question or want to say something. We do have one question to begin with here in the audience.
Hi, this is Amir Zakin, CIVIC person. Okay, so I read through the paper and I think there is some time given in the paper to complicating the issue of merit, and that's fair enough. But what I think I want to bring up, which complicates things even more, which is this idea that in order to get to the point of having merit, you know, the playing field, so to speak, needs to be even. So, you know, I'll use a very simple example. Let's say a spelling bee. The kid who's going to win the spelling bee is going to be the kid with the best resources, right? It may be that they have the parents who enforce a certain kind of rigor in terms of studying. They have a neighborhood. I could go on and on and on, right? The child who grows up in a situation with the right schools, with the right resources, with the right parenting, who ends up in the right place to do the right science, is going to be objectively do the more meritorious work than the one who doesn't.
Who do you want to operate on you?
Yes, that person. I don't have a problem with that. This is the complication. I want that person. Speaking of, I had brain surgery 6 months ago. I want the best brain surgeon. There's no doubt. But the problem with that is the best brain surgeon may not.
Why is it a problem?
Because the situation from the 2-year-olds is not equal. The neighborhood, the class structure in our, I'm going to start with class. The class structure in our country, start with our country, is not equal.
So we should fix
Okay.
it at the bottom.
Yes, I would say that my answer always is to look from when they can barely walk and start
From the
looking there.
birth, as Laurie says, from the birth time. That's the way to fix inequalities, which is hard and
Yes.
takes time.
Takes a long time.
And then, what is done under DI, it's putting patches on the top.
Yeah,
Which is,
the fix is when you're 18 years old. I have a lot of problems, but this idea that you know, you choose the kind of most meritorious. I think it's simplistic to say that the most meritorious is this kind of objectively
not when you
Yeah.
look for a brain surgeon, then
Yeah.
it's very simple.
yeah.
See if there are some people from you online who would like to enter the discussion. Any
Can I
folks out-
enter the discussion?
Go ahead, Kurt.
I raised
Okay,
my hand. I raised my
I'm
hand.
sorry. Whose hand is
I
up?
tried to raise my hand, but that didn't work on my computer.
So go ahead.
Okay, Elon, I'll go ahead and then you follow straight away after me.
No worries.
And I have a couple of comments, and one of them is that something that addresses the whole issue of pipeline and people who are not in the game for whatever reason. I think you can't just say that those with better resources, those with resources and aptitudes, you have to have aptitude to do things. With all due respect to the framers of our Constitution, not everybody's created equal. And I think that if you want to even the playing field, that's amusing, but what you're really after is fairness. The bottom line is you want a fair system. The idea that a fair system will somehow figure out how to have people apportioned in different disciplines according to their respective percentages in the population sounds to me a little nutty. Well, actually it doesn't. It sounds a lot nutty. And I think that somebody mentioned this already, I think the last speaker. You have to get to the early stages of life to really make an impact, and trying to put a bunch of Band-Aids on it when people are a couple of decades older is not nearly as effective. And I think that that brings in a huge amount of complexity all by itself. But that's where a lot of the problem lies, because you really want people who are educated well enough so they can make decisions about their future, and they don't need anybody telling them that you have to go into physics or law or anything like that. They will know if they're educated well in their very early years and they're reading real things, not glorified comic books, that they will start to learn how to make decisions for themselves, and they will seek and obtain the guidance they need to advance. So I think that a lot of the stuff about meritocracy and so on, I am a big believer in meritocracy, and I think that you want to really get people up to the point where you can say they are meritorious. You want to do it properly so that they are good ambassadors, et cetera, and not fiddle around with strange things coming out of DEI. Okay, Elon, take it away.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Anna and all of you for raising this topic for discussion. Now, my research profile is totally different than most of yours. I'm not an R01 researcher. I'm more of a clinical researcher, where I try to apply whatever findings I have, to the chair side. So that was my focus. And but still, I have a few issues about, you know, the merit of science, because I see a few points that are of hurdle. Number one, and I don't want to sound pretentious, I have a feeling that our current students or the younger generation is expecting to have quick results and give it less effort. It's like more of an immediate gratification. And I notice it in our students, in our residents. So they are more inclined to look for encouragements, which may be false encouragements. They need, you know, constantly to be petted for every little, you know, advancement that they made. And again, I don't want to sound like, hey, you know, I'm the old school and they are, you know, each generation has their own merit, but I don't know. This is what I sense in the students and in the young generation, that only a few really, you know, look for, you know, the I would say the uphill battle and the frustrations that are associated with research and science. We all know that. And, you know, you need to run an experiment 100 times until eventually, you know, you get something. And all these failures, you have to stomach them. And I have a feeling that many, you know, the current students, they are not willing to stomach those failures. They need to always say, oh, okay, oh, heard that, you know what, this is great. And I can give you an example. You know, we have
I
clinicians.
think we get to a question and let others go on. Do
Okay.
you have a question?
Oh, you mean like a question?
Yeah, like
Oh,
a question.
I thought it was like more of a comment.
We want to
So
make sure.
yeah. So my question, yeah, I'm
Yes.
sorry. My question here is, and it's related to a quick observation, is what is our own colleagues' role in this issue of merit? Because it seems that sometimes folks have done excellent job, produced some interesting findings that do not follow the general consensus, and they are being basically, you know, marginalized and being, you know, ridiculed. And so what the question is, you know, is there a way to address that?
I think is a way to address this. The way to address it is not to try to censor people based on political opinions, and to allow all opinions to be put in the open and debated, and then through the criticism of peers and through the editorial process and reality-based community, so the truth will come to the top. And the examples that were mentioned before with the COVID and some questionable handling of the situation would have been prevented if the ideas of those people who spoke against some or doubted some mainstream opinions would be discussed in the open and put to scrutiny to see whether they hold water or not.
Thank you. I think Marisol had her hand up. Marisol, are you still there?
Yeah, sure. I want to thank very much for the great debate and the great information provided. I had a comment and a question. So I think like DEI for me, and instead of focusing on merit, causes a lot of problem. Among them, I think it actually increases discrimination and racism, because if you see a person of like minority status, let's say I'm a Hispanic immigrant woman, and I am a scientist, you know, I'm a professor at Michigan State University, I don't want to think that people might think of me as a diversity hire and look down on me and think of me as less capable. And I think focusing on DI instead of merit encourages this. It encourages, instead of people being looked at objectively through their merit, to be looked down upon on top of people who are excellent and meritorious, being discriminated against and not hired, which would be a great injustice. Now, my question is for both of the debaters, and then what could we do to kind of turn this around? I noticed the students, I've had a lot of hatred from students and even other faculty. They seem to not understand, and they seem to think if you support merit, that you are like racist and all these other insults. What could we do to help turn this around and help them to understand our point of view?
Okay, I can start. Thanks for the comment and for the question and for attending. I think, well, Thomas Sowell, I think, called the education process as continuous coming of little barbarians into a system who needs to be educated. And unfortunately, you know, universities start to abandon their role in educating students and increasingly treat students as customers and listen to their whims and often poorly prioritized opinions. So I think the only way is education and explanation, and I think we have a chance because students, you know, may be misguided in their thinking, but they are not stupid. And if you lay down evidence and arguments exactly of the type you presented, it will change minds of many. Now, I feel particularly very strong about this negative effect of DI that you mentioned, that by instituting these quotas for awards, for hiring, for distinctions, for conference speakers, these programs take away achievements from people who deserve it. Now, if I ask myself, Anna, would you get all this slew of awards you got if you were a man? And you know, I think very highly of my science, but the answer is no. And that's very hurtful, and that's what perpetuates biases against women and minorities, because people quietly think and say, okay, here is a woman elected in this or that. Well, you know, she's a woman. What do you want? And that's very damaging. So
Let's see if,
Yeah, excellent answer.
Michael, do you want to respond?
Well, I don't really have a solution to that, which is, of course, a serious problem, even with a kind of a sincere attempt to make science and life just more fair for everybody. But maybe could I change the subject? Well, not change the subject, but just move the discussion in a slightly different direction.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, the kinds of I don't know, it sounds, let me just call them the DEI people. DEI people are trying to make the world a fairer place, a place that's better in a certain way. They, in a fairy tale ending, it would turn out that equalizing the playing field in the right kind of way would in no way reduce the quality of outcomes for all the rest of us. But there's a real danger. Well, I won't call it a danger. There's a trade-off. So the more you take into account fairness or social justice, the more there's likely to be some kind of penalty along some other dimensions. And one question we can ask about the process of science is exactly how sensitive it is to those kinds of penalties. Does it really matter if we were to sort of exactly who's in our labs? You know, for some kinds of operations, like maybe brain surgery is a case of this, the difference between having a brain surgeon who's in the top 2% versus the top 5% might actually be a huge difference in outcome. But for a lot of things in life, actually, it doesn't make much difference. As long as you have someone who's in the top 25%, the job gets done well enough. So now I'm not going to supply answers. I'm going to ask a question. Is most scientific research more like the brain surgeon case or the other kind of case? Is it something where very small differences in talent are going to make a difference to outcomes, or is it the kind of case where as long as somebody is well educated and good and knows what they're doing and is motivated, is doing the job, then things are going to turn out okay?
Well, my opinion is, yes, it is like a brain surgeon. If you do not take the best people, you do not deliver best science. And if you do not deliver best science, you do not make breakthroughs. And we see already decline of US competitiveness globally, and China already surpassed US in several domains. Why? Because we keep undermining the merit. And so I think the idea of trade-off, let's dilute merit by a little bit diversity and hope for the good, it sounds not terribly offensive, but we know that it doesn't work and it's a slippery slope. So now, what was the first point that you mentioned? I think before diluting, there was second thought that I.
Well, no, that was my question. Maybe I can just push back a little bit against that. So take something like the eclipse measurements. So you had measurements done by the Eddington team and measurements done by the Campbell team. Now, no doubt these are two groups of incredibly accomplished people, but which was better in the end? I think I'm not sure it really matters. The Campbell team was a little bit luckier with maybe how well their equipment worked, or how cloudy the skies were on the day of the eclipse. But as long as somebody who knew what they were doing was in position to take those photographs, then you got good data. And if something went wrong, then it didn't matter how accomplished or how brilliant the experimenters were. You don't get good data. So I'm not, of course, arguing that anyone could have done those experiments. Almost nobody could have done those experiments. But the difference at the margin maybe is not so important.
Well, putting poorly qualified people on their team definitely would not have improved the results. Now, I remembered the first point I wanted to make. You said that DI people want to change world to a better place. I fundamentally disagree. They want to take over and they want to reverse the inequalities, and we saw how it works in Russia. So the idea of socialism, of equality, full equality, led to oceans of blood. In the context of American system, we do not see blood yet, but we saw some gross injustices already imposed by DI. And the most striking example to me is affirmative action and the discrimination it imposed on overachieving Asian Americans that were passed over in the name of equity and diversity. So this is not making the world a better place.
Let's see if somebody here, Richard, and then we'll go to you, Michael.
So I'd like to go to a practical question that gets into this. So I'm not sure, given this crowd, that there's anybody here that's a real, sort of woke sort of person. But the solution for this is really to try to counter some of this, right? Now, there is a solution that's happening here in the United States, and it's not happening in the blue states, it's happening in the red states, where they're forbidding this stuff for quite different reasons, probably not the ones. So the question I have is, and there are pieces of DEI that I actually support different than you do. And I think it's important for us to try to have a diverse student body here, for instance. And there are particular reasons. I mean, I think, for instance, when women came to the workforce, the fact that we really sort of pushed that, doubled the number of people and the work and the economy, boom. But anyway, so the question is, as you are trying to solve this problem here, like at UCR, right? How do we go ahead and solve that without essentially becoming the tools, if you will, of the right? Okay, because it's a really practical question that we wanna address, right? Because that's the kind of criticism we get when we say DEI is not a good thing. They either say, they say you're part of that.
Well, I can comment. I think universities, I do not approve a heavy-handed legislation. Because I believe that having universities free and academic freedom is important, but universities brought it on themselves. And if universities were unpolitical and did not started this massive DI bureaucracies, the legislators would have no business regulating what can and cannot be taught. So now, when we talk about DI, like just to, I'm a chemist, theoretical chemist, I like numbers. So to give you just one number to think about, at UC Berkeley, annual budget for DEI is $41 million. $41 million going to where? To salaries of highly paid, useless bureaucrats. So this is not making a playing field equal, that doesn't elevate people, it doesn't contribute to education, it's a complete waste of money. So I think we have to abolish DI and we have to focus on what universities are supposed to do. This is truth-seeking and education. We should do it best.
You agree? Essentially.
I do not agree with how they do it, and I do not like this because it really will have negative consequences down the road. Because the whole idea of legislations interfering with universities is bad. But I'm frustrated to see how universities completely abandoned their missions. And what do you say about UC Berkeley? So they decided to put $41 million in DI. So someone has to stop it. I would like to see universities themselves stopping it and coming, renewed from this debate. But it's really corruption that for regular citizens should be unacceptable, right? So you do not want to support these bureaucracies. You want to support universities to do, so they do what they're supposed to do, it, not to propagate some ideology. So,
Michael Weissman.
Yes, I'd like to, I think Michael Strevens raised a really important question, which is the sensitivity of what we can produce to what seem like perhaps small differences in our abilities. And as a physicist, I'd have to say that there is enormous sensitivity. I mean, I was on the whole not particularly good in terms of character structure, but smarter than average. And I think every single day I could have done better by being smarter. It just, and you watch your colleagues and what they can understand. There's an enormous difference, but with a subtle twist, which is that there's a genuine diversity in the type of tasks we do. So if you look at the overall effort, there are people who aren't good at math at all, but who are miracle workers in the lab. And to get something done, you need both, an actual diversity of that type, which is maybe pretty much orthogonal to the type of diversity that DEI committees are, working on. But so the merit needed to make real research work is actually, it's real, but it's not, it's not unidimensional, it's multidimensional.
I agree with that. Yeah.
I think we have agreement here from Anna. Carol.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted, I'll be very quick, but I think there is an argument that has been alluded to by several speakers, but I would just like to state it sort of in a more obvious way. So my personal line of defense for meritocracy would be not only everything that the people here mentioned, but just its simplicity. Basically, whenever I get into the arguments about this with people, I ask them what is their opinion about democracy, and I can list a huge number of flaws of democracy. For example, my voice, my vote, well, my vote is worth exactly the same as the vote of somebody who probably never gave any thought to any political issue. And is this fair? No, obviously it's not fair, but the huge advantage of democracy is simplicity, because trying to actually gauge whose vote is worth how much would generate a class of bureaucracy that is never going to be benevolent, it's going to become self-servant, and so on. And so we just give up on that idea of actually measuring how much every vote is worth by sort of preferring simplicity to that. And the system in which we are doing science that is actually based on who is at the end turns out to be right is simple. Whereas if we employ the DI bureaucracy to actually try to adjust certain things, it's a huge overhead. Well, some people have mentioned the cost of this overhead, but another thing is that this is never going to be a benevolent bureaucracy. So whatever the flaws of meritocracy might be, and any enterprise that involves humans is going to have flaws associated with humans, not employing a huge bureaucracy layer on top of that, to me, is a huge benefit. And I think that should be a pretty simple argument. Thank you.
I agree with that strongly. And I also would like to emphasize an argument that Thomas Sowell makes very often. He warns in the context of economics about dangers of separating decision power from people who experience consequences. And that's what we see with these diversity committees. They make their decisions, but people who suffer are students who are affected by that, research that has not been done, and that's additional negative effect of it.
So, Anna, could I speak, please? Very briefly, this is David Lillis. I don't have a button here, so I'll try to be very quick. I'm beaming in from New Zealand. I think I see 2 or 3 others coming in from New Zealand. In my view, there should be absolutely no negotiation. It's non-negotiable that we maintain excellence in science. And what we've seen in New Zealand in the last few years is almost a complete rewrite of this notion of excellence. Excellence is not a slippery or difficult concept. It may look a little bit different if you're in the public sector or the private sector. It might look a little different if you're in environment and climate as opposed to public health and so on. But what we're seeing in New Zealand is a rewriting of this notion of excellence. Very, very worrying. And you will see a degrading of our overall science effort. And this is why I personally have been involved in this fight here in New Zealand. No pushback, no compromise on this notion of excellence, or else you get a slippery slope and a degrading of our overall science effort.
I see nodding on Anna's part. I don't know, Michael, whether you want to say anything. If not, then we'll go to Kurt.
Okay, you guys are getting desperate. They're back to me again. I would like to comment on some of the issues that have been brought up. And in particular, DEI seems to be getting a lot of press at this meeting here. And rather than talk about DEI and castigating it even more, what I would do is something that is not really being done in at least the university that I work at. Now, we talk about bringing in people with, let's say, not the highest figures of merit in their high school performance, et cetera. And then, of course, you have the counterpart for graduate entrance. And they come in different flavors. And what is inevitable is that if you don't do something about it, bringing in people with lower performance records will lower standards. If you don't do anything about it, you aren't going to fail the whole class or even an honest third of the class. And that's really at the heart of what has just been mentioned from New Zealand about maintaining excellence. And let's get to the simplicity issue. To hell, I mean, not to hell, the heck with DEI. let's just worry about the problem that's at hand. Now, I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth, and I know the harsh side of life. And there might be some people out there who really didn't have access to this and that as far as education, and they're pretty bright. They're smart. I often wonder, you know, if I had made the wrong turn, whether I'd still be smart or not. But the thing is, the university takes them in, and then all of a sudden they're supposed to get grades in classes that exist. And it doesn't compute, honest to God. Even if they were kind of smart, they go to some rotten high school and they aren't trained well enough. What we have to do is adapt. We have to be flexible. And we don't have to be complicated to be flexible. We can do it with great simplicity. All you have to do is allow them to take the courses that they should have had in high school. We have witnessed a systematic deterioration of the intellectual acuity and prowess of kids for the last 25 years. And I personally blame social media and computers and so on, but that's another story. But I think you could have them take the courses they need. Kid comes in, I like engineering, doesn't know a hell of a lot of math. Have them take the math they need before they wind up in a course in mathematics that's above them, above their head. And then what are they going to do? Survive? It's not working. We all know it's not working. We're just whining about what to do about it. So I think we have solutions exist, and you can, and one of the reasons you can see how the solutions exist is we get people in graduate school and they don't do so well. And when they come in, I don't care about your 3.88 average. They don't do so well, period. Go to a community college and learn what you should have learned, and then come back. So I think
Thank
the
you,
answer.
Kurt.
The
Thanks
answer
very
actually,
much.
Okay, I'll shut up. Okay, bye.
Do you want to say anything, Anna?
Yeah.
Well, I agree that we should be investing in different educational activities that can help to open access, but not by bringing underqualified people into places where they cannot succeed and bring the complete.
Okay, one.
Richard, I just want to kind of tie a few things together. So how long have you been here?
34 years.
Okay, so I've been here 24, so I'm less but a long time. So I've witnessed two things happen simultaneously. One, I would say good, one not so good. One is the student body diversity on the campus in 24 years that I've been here has increased. It's kind of what you talked about. It's a positive thing. I walk around the campus, I've seen it change in a way that I think is great. My students are coming from much more culturally diverse backgrounds than when I first walked on campus. I think that's a good thing. I think the intellectual diversity on campus has probably dropped. I don't think that's such a great thing. I think it is sort of a slope. Those two things have complicated linkages, right? So that's going on. The third, which I think is maybe the part that I think that I'm learning now, that I think is maybe the worst part of this puzzle, is that the last few years I've been on the Academic Senate Committee for academic integrity, where we look at students who are cheating, doing things like that. And I've been kind of keeping track of it because I'm in my third year and actually asked for data, and I have all the data now. Just to make it short, we basically bust and punish. I would say it's in the probably 90% of the students that we sanction are students who fall into the, let me just say in air quotes, of color students. So then here's the overall message. This is the diabolical part, I think, of the whole thing. Is the University of California, Riverside boasts itself as the most diverse University of California, and it is. So we get to brag, hey, look at our numbers, everybody. 50% this, because this is the numbers they care about. This ethnicity, this ethnicity, this ethnicity, which I think is fine and great and blah, blah, blah. And then while they're in the program, because they're not doing well, they're struggling, they're working too many jobs, they're not sleeping well, they're stressed out. I listen to all their stories and they're all legitimate. They're failing, they cheat, they get in trouble for it. This is all happening under the rug. We suspend them. Ultimately, they get kicked out. Nobody talks about that. That's happening under here. So it's this kind of awful, in a way, system. So on the surface, it's that we're promoting this kind of diversity that looks great. I'm watching all the students walk around campus, looks wonderful. It's this kind of utopia in some kind of way. And then what's really happening is it's kind of crushing to me to see what's actually happening, because they're not prepared and it's not their fault, because we're bringing them in. We're the university. They don't get it at UCLA. They don't get it at any other universities of California. UCR says, we'll take your money. Sorry. And then when you can't hack it, and when you have to work a full-time job, and you're the first generation of your family to get into school, and can't actually pass your class, we'll sanction you and eventually kick you out. So, sorry.
So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm gonna say something, probably are running out of time here, unfortunately. My own feeling about this, I'm gonna try to bring something Michael said in to this remark. The way we have tried to have better representation, we've required a way of thinking to go along with that better representation. And from my point of view, the way of thinking is the problem. Conformity of, you must have certain kinds of values. And the way it relates to something Michael said is, we need robust debate. We need robust evidence gathering. We need a lot of people who think differently out there to try to criticize each other and go beyond each other, collect more data. And I guess my big worry is that if you have this kind of level of conformity with values, you get less of that. And to me, that's the biggest concern. I mean, when we had the University of California and the free speech movement, the whole idea was to have nonconformity and have people collect more data and have people debate. And I just feel like that we're getting this environment where you're highly constrained about what can be said and what can be part of debate. And that, I think, is the worst part of the situation as far as I'm concerned. All right, I'm going to let Michael and Anna have the last word if they want to have the last word.
I wanted just maybe not the last word, but I wanted to comment. One brought by Amir and one that you brought up. Yes, there is quantitative data that shows the harms of affirmative action on students it's supposed to benefit. There is a book called Dubious Expediency, where there is a thorough research of what happens with students who are admitted under affirmative action, often 2 standards deviation below of other students, and how they fail, how they get moved into fluffy disciplines and how damaging it is for their careers. Now, about debate and stifling of debate and conformity, yes, in universities, it's also documented by studies that shows that there is a huge monoculture emerging, and culture of debate and discussion is unfortunately not thriving on American campuses. And to me, that's also very reminiscent of Soviet Union times, when there was only one correct answer to every question, and that was what party thinks about it, and that didn't work well. So,
Thank you. Michael, do you have any last words?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I just want to echo what you just said, Stephen, that these are complicated issues, and science is a very complicated institution that we don't, in fact, I think, understand 100% well. At least part of our effort should be trying to understand it better with, of course, a philosophy of science, that goes without saying, and also a science of science. Then maybe we can not just kind of, as it were, express our opinions about what will be good for science, but actually find out more about what will be good for science.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, and everyone online. Thanks for participating, and everyone here. Let's give a hand to. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
so we had a lot of comments in the chat. I wonder if we can save them and maybe share with
Do
participants.
you know how to?
I think it's saved somewhere, but we need to find it. It was showing recording.
Okay. It's
So,
over.
anyway.
So we can. See. Leave meeting.